President's State of the Nation address on Thursday, many views around whether he and the government he leads have started living up to the promises that it's made in the past. If you consider there have been so many promises from several presidents over the last 15 or 20 years, most of those promises boil down to the same thing: your life will get better. It's a big question to ask if, indeed, whether that is now happening. Professor William Gumede is the founder of the Democracy Works programme. Prof, good morning to you. Is there some evidence to suggest government or the president are beginning to live up to their promises? I mean, is there any evidence that lives maybe slowly, maybe very slowly, are getting it all better?
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers. Yes, I mean, it's been a tough couple of years for South Africans. But I think there's a glimmer of hope. I mean, the government of national unity that we have offers a glimmer of hope. I think it would have been absolutely worse and more hopeless if it was just an ANC government like it was the last 30 years. Now it's a multi-party government. So there's so much more opportunities and so much more energy. Obviously, you know, to turn this big tank South African economy, it will take a while. But I am cautiously optimistic. For example, I just say, I mean, if the government is just able, for example, to cut 10% of corruption, that will give us that will give us a 2% growth bounce. I mean, just think of it, cutting corruption decisively just by 10 or so percent will give us some kind of growth. And even just focusing all out of just on maintaining and cleaning up, I mean, will give us extra growth and so on. So, and I know that is not what people want to hear, because people normally think about, sort of big, spectacular things and infrastructure and so on. But cleanups alone, and if it's really done genuinely and aggressively, will really help us.
One of the big things that's changed, obviously, is that more people have more electricity more often. Load reduction is still a problem, but load shedding, apart from what happened this weekend, I think generally there's no longer the problem that it was. That's obviously a big improvement, right? Good. I worry hugely about water, and I worry that water may be more difficult to fix because load shedding could, in the end, be controlled by national government through Eskom. Water problems involve local government, and in most places, let me be blunt, in 8 provinces, it's frankly a disaster. And I don't think that's as easy to fix.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. The problem is, for all of our infrastructure, because infrastructure has been so neglected, last couple of decades, and there's been no new infrastructure built. Either what happens, as an asset class, what happens with infrastructure, you don't see it collapsing. It declines, and then it reaches a tipping point where everything collapses. So that's where we are in South Africa now. Water, our power, obviously before, but every what we call infrastructure, we start to see collapsing. And this is not a conspiracy. It is not that is happening suddenly, but it is, it has been happening along for a while, and we didn't see it, and then suddenly the whole thing collapses. So that's where we are, and when you have water infrastructure collapse, is much more harder, difficult. I mean, there's a glimmer of hope even in that, is that most of our water collapse, service delivery collapse, has been a governance issue rather than a scarcity of water issue. So so if you can fix the governance, the corruption, the incompetence, again, everything starts. I mean, there's this sort of corruption, incompetence, and poor policies combines, and neglect of maintenance combines. That is actually what is hitting the country now. So it's come over time. But again, with water, if we can get just some of the governance issues right, and some of the competence issues. So competence is bring in competent people, and unfortunately, there's a cultural issue, political cultural issue in the country, and it's not only in the ANC but among ordinary people also. There is a poor understanding that it is competence above everything. So if a country or an organization doesn't appoint a competent individual, it will fail no matter what you do. and so on. And we really, if we can get that right, even on the water side, just get a competence, get a corruption, deal with the governance issues, and I think that could also we could have a turnaround there also.
I mean, I'd like to hope that you're right. Does a coalition government make that more likely? So, on what level you would think it would? This is people sort of competing with each other, but have to sit around the same table. That together they might decide, well, let's just appoint the competent person. Unfortunately, if you look in local government coalitions, that hasn't been the experience. The experience has been something very different. Do you think a coalition makes it harder or easier to make sure that the right people are appointed, or competent people are appointed, rather, to where they should be?
I mean, it's just the first thing to say is coalitions are the, coalition form of government is the best governance model for a diverse society. I mean, we've seen it, it's almost 200 years since the first African country became independent, that's Liberia. And the only governance that has worked over this period has been coalitions. Every other kind of government across the continent has absolutely failed in ways that historically must have been sort of the worst run. Africa has had the worst run, possibly comparable to any continent historically. But the countries that done well, even if they were not even diverse, has been on coalition. So that's an absolutely important. And in our country, our diverse society, one group is not going to deliver us peace and growth and jobs and dealing with poverty. That is, it's a myth. Anyone that believes that is, up for failure. So coalitions, and we have to make it work. I mean, the exciting thing, or rather the beauty of coalitions is one learn together how to reach consensus and how to make decisions in the interest of everyone. And it is, it's a learning exercise, and so on. There are some municipalities where the coalitions are working. They're not a majority, but there's some coalitions that's absolutely working at a municipal level. Even now, I mean, at a national level, what we're seeing the last 6 or 9 months of our national coalition is already more that we've seen, even at the equivalent periods of the Zuma presidency and the Ramaphosa presidencies, when the ANC was dominant.
One of the biggest issues, I think, that stands in the way of any economic growth, in the way of a better life for anyone, never mind all of us, is around the rule of law. And I mean, Professor, if you've left your house today and gone just 5 meters down a road, you will have seen how, a minibus taxi driver or someone would probably have broken the law. Often in front of a police officer, no one does anything. And that's just a tiny example. Violent crime, extortion, all of these have really escalated in the years since the pandemic. And there's control may be the wrong word, but there's a lack of order. Order could also be the wrong word, has some bad connotations from our past. But there's certainly a lack of rule of law in our society. And without that, if we don't agree on the rules of the game, if we don't agree on the rules to live together and all agree to obey them, well, then might is right. The most powerful in our society wins, whether it is a group of people who extort money from a young woman wearing a weave in Khayelitsha, whether it's politics in KwaZulu-Natal, whatever. How do we avoid that from getting any worse? Because isn't that really what stands in the way of a growing economy?
Now, absolutely, rule of law is the absolute basic to get our economy going, to deal with poverty and to deal with unemployment and to make our country safe. And then, linked to that is people following rules is absolutely important. There is no way our country or any country can deal with poverty or create jobs if there is if the country doesn't have rule of law and there is not a rule-based society or order-based society. It's at the heart of it. I mean, yesterday I look at a pic. It was an interesting pic. It was kids, 60 or 70-year-olds in Japan crossing a street. And then the driver at a stop street slowed down sort of almost 20, 30 meters before the actual stop sign, to sort of the children can pass safely. When the children pass, The children bowed and said thank you in gratitude for the driver, and so on. So, and when we often talked, the last couple of years about the developmental state that Japan and Singapore and so on, that really created economic miracles. At the heart of those economic miracles was rule of law, order in a rule-based society. So it's absolutely going to be important. I mean, what happened last week in Mpumalanga, when taxi drivers allegedly torched particle buses, and so on. So that sort of thing happening in our country, this sort of violent behavior will have to be dealt with. So, these sort of mafia groups that breaks the law and who are violent and they get away with it creates a culture in our society where no one will follow the rule. And then when also where property rights are not stable, because if anyone can just come and hijack your building, burn your bus, or hijack your flats or your house, or a construction mafia in the rural areas just take your business. There's no way that anyone will invest and anyone will start a new business and create jobs and so on. So it's absolutely important that all of society understand that the rule of law, good behavior when nobody looks, is very important to create jobs and to deal with poverty.
There's so much going on in our society, and you made a point at the very beginning that a coalition is the best way to run a diverse society. There's something else that happens, and it's not just, I think, because of our sort of longer-term history. It's also because of our recent political history, perhaps, that a lot of South Africans don't trust each other. It seems to me that our politicians do very well about working to make sure we do not trust each other. I mean, it's not that they've all been looking at Donald Trump over the years. It's just, this is the playbook, right? And so, we have politicians now who deliberately undermine the rule of law. We have politicians now who get more votes by saying to their voters, we'll make sure this person who's broken the law must now pay the consequences. You don't have to think about who I'm thinking about. You know who I mean. So I worry that it just becomes a political football, but the legitimacy, it's such a big word, legitimacy, that you voluntarily accept the rules. All of that's gone. And I can't blame people for that. I do it too. I go through a red robot from time to time, simply because it's become what we do. Load shedding means that I don't respect robots anymore.
No, absolutely. It's not going to be easy, to turn around, because now we've got a culture of impunity, or a culture of rule breaking. And in our society, like other societies, because our history, when we have a history where people can blame the past on for present things. For example, somebody, say, political leader, breaks the law, and then he say, oh, well, the apartheid people did it, why do I need to be prosecuted? So it is absolutely important that we move as a society from that kind of culture, that we live in the present and measure people and politicians and the government on what they do in the present and not in the past. Now, I mean, the big structural fault in our politics is that anyone can just become a politician and become very successful if you blame other racial groups, if you blame apartheid, if you write popular slogans saying you're going to deliver nirvana and heaven on earth for everyone, you're going to take from somebody else to give for those who don't have. So there's an easy everyone, that's the easiest for politicians, to make money and to get elected. But that is the worst for a country. It is the worst for creating jobs. The worst for poverty reduction, because in societies you can only reduce poverty and get growth and create jobs. When you govern in the present, and when people measure you for what you do now, and when leaders are not victim-based on the past, and where the supporters also are not victim-based or vote for people based on the past. They have to vote for people in the present, because that's almost the only way that one can hold somebody accountable. If one doesn't hold a leader, a political leader or a politician accountable for what they do now, and one, let them get away because they blame the past, there will never be positive transformation in a society. So in a sense that we need a political cultural change in our country, where voters begin to vote for people not because they look like them or they speak like them or they come from the same village or they attack other ethnic groups, or they attack foreigners, or they blame apartheid or colonialism, or they attack some conspiracies, white monopoly capital, and so on, for often self-inflicted problems that we have in the country. So the key thing is, how do we change our politics from one for voters to begin to see that I have to vote sometimes for people and for parties that don't look like them, and don't have the same ethnic group as them, they don't have the same color, and they don't do emotional stuff, and so on, and they don't make populist promises, but they are really passionate and caring, and they are competent, and they will deliver. Rather than the people who blame others, politicians who blame others for everything, who makes emotional promises, who attack others, who's never ever run anything in their lives. And if when voters vote for these type of people, it's emotionally good, but it harm not only the voters, but the future of the voters' children and their children.
I mean, in the history of the world's longest continuous democracy for the moment, the United States, you could argue the majority of the country has voted for someone who doesn't look like them precisely once, in the case of Barack Obama. I mean, you could argue against that to an extent, but that's kind of what you're talking about. It hardly ever happens. It's a big thing. There's another kind of thing around all of this, Professor, if I may, and particularly President Cyril Ramaphosa. For the first time, really, a president this year, he's going to deliver his State of the Nation address. It's not just domestic issues. I mean, infighting in the ANC and Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, well, leaders have been dealing with that for years. A coalition, it is new, it is different, it's been long expected, so okay. But this year, the president also has to deal with the threats from Washington, and he has to deal, almost uniquely, with the situation involving Rwanda and the fact that 14 of our soldiers have been killed. It's a big range of problems that the president has to deal with. I must say there's part of me that thinks maybe he could use Rwanda and Trump to sort of foster some national unity. Might be quite difficult to do politically, but that doesn't all of that make his speech quite difficult on Thursday?
No, absolutely. It's a difficult speech, but also what it makes it more difficult is that, the ANC is not a dominant party anymore. The ANC is now in a coalition with 10 parties in a coalition. So it's a multi-party coalition. So that means it's a culture shift for the president, but also for the ANC. But the president has been struggling to make the cultural shift. And the ANC and their members and supporters have struggled to see the ANC not anymore as a dominant party, but a multi-party government that now have to co-govern with others. So, for example, I mean, it would be interesting to see whether the president sat down with his coalition partners, with the GNU partners, and said, let's think together how I am going to position the State of the Nation address, because that is what coalition government's all about. In terms of, you govern with a bigger front, you bring more ideas and more energy to bear. It's not just only your own party and your own advisors, but you get a view of everyone. Now, the problem has been obviously for the ANC and for many African liberation movements, they cannot make the transition from a liberation movement, opposition type of movement, into an effective democratic modern governing party. Now, liberation movements, they focus only on their constituencies, their supporters, so speeches, State of the Nation addresses, if it's the president, is always targeted at their own constituencies. Now, in a governing party, the whole country becomes your constituency. So everything a president does or a governing party does is aims as a whole country, not just the interests of your own constituencies. And often with liberation movement, their leaders and their members think that their party's interest is the national interest or the country's interest. And it's almost never, ever the same. A country's interest is much broader. For example, now with the Trump, what is South Africa's country's interest? And South Africa's country's interest is different than the ANC's country's interest when it comes to Trump and when it comes to the US. Our interest is now we have to calm down to the situation. We have to protect businesses in South Africa. We have to protect trades. We have to protect interests. And then, what kind of strategy do we do that?
Right.
And I think it would be important here. This is a real opportunity maybe for the president to finally make that stuff from a president for the ANC to a president for the country. If we can make that stuff,
Prof,
it will.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Such an important point you're making. Really appreciate the time. Professor William Gumede, the founder of Democracy Works.